I'd like now to introduce Donna Barnes, who's an associate professor at Howard University's Department of Psychiatry, teaching suicide risk management to third-year psychiatry, to third-year medical students, and the founder of NOPCAS after losing her son, Mark Jamal Barnes, to suicide at age 20 when he was in college. As you've heard us talk, we just ended the professional part of the AAS conference in which the theme was equity and inclusion. Donna has been concerned about and focusing on the impact of suicide in our Black and Brown communities for decades. For the wizard of the metaphor of the Wizard of Oz, and as a friend, she gives me both seriousness and laughter. And for those too new in your journey who don't believe belly laughs will ever be possible again, take it from me and Donna, they will be. I'm also gonna say that after Donna's talk, and Carla is gonna have a conversation with her, Carla Fine is the author of very many books, including the internationally best-selling book, No Time to Say Goodbye, Surviving the Suicide of a Loved One. It's the story of the suicide of her 43-year-old husband, Dr. Harry Wrights, in 1989, as well as interviews with over 60 other survivors of suicide loss. She lectures extensively to suicide survivor groups and professional organizations, and also offers workshops on writing as a path to healing when coping with the death of a loved one. When I think of Carla, what comes up for me is that she has the ability to look at death and not look away. I count her as a close friend, indeed a sister, and for that Wizard of Oz metaphor, I call her connection. So I want to welcome Donna to the stage, and I want her to be pinned.
What does that mean? Okay.
When we pin you, you're gonna get large.
Really?
There you go.
I'm still small.
Welcome, Donna. If we all press our gallery view to speaker view, we see you large.
Okay. I don't see my gallery view, but that's okay. Well, thank you. Thank you, thank you, thank you. I want to thank you, Vanessa, for inviting me along with AAS, AFSP, and TAPS. I've worked and known you guys for a very long time, and I appreciate all the support you've given me in my journey and inviting me here today. This is such an honor. I'm going to set my timer for 44 minutes and so that I can stay within that time frame. For me to tell my story would take 8, 9, 10 hours. So to condense it to 45 minutes is challenging. So I'll try not to sidebar too much. In 1990, I got a call from one of the counselors at my son, Mark Jamal Barnes' school. He was going to the University of Lowell up in Lowell, Massachusetts. And they told me he had left the dorm room and left a couple of notes behind. And when they read me the notes sounded like they were suicide notes. When people talk about the expression knees knocking, I never knew what that meant, or knees buckling. And I knew what that meant that night. I almost fell to the floor because I was standing up on the phone call and I almost fell to the floor. I was extremely confused simply because my son, to me, in my knowledge, did not show any signs of distress, absolutely none. He was always smiling, always telling jokes, always making sure people were comfortable in a room. He would walk into a room and look around and say, what can I do to make these people feel comfortable? He looked at it objectively. He was always trying to make people feel comfortable. He was a very sensitive young man. He was in school strictly for baseball. Baseball was his heart. And the Detroit Lions were looking at him. They said, Mark, we're going to follow you, because they noticed him in high school. And his father had told him, like most parents, like most of us would advise, that you got to finish college first. So he was there on a college, on a baseball scholarship, really didn't want to be there, but was trying his best. Then he gets some word from one of the counselors that if you don't get your grades up, you're not going to be able to play. The morning of his disappearance, he had taken a geology exam. He didn't feel like he had done well. He started really feeling overwhelmed. And then he left his dorm room and drove his car into the Merrimack River. If someone had asked me the day before, I think your son's going to take his own life, I would have said, you're crazy. My son has lots of friends. He's very happy. He's very jovial. You don't know what you're talking about. So I was extremely confused, didn't know what to do, felt lost. My family didn't know what to do with me, even though they were very loving. They did not know what to do with me. My daughter was 16 at the time, so together we struggled with trying to figure this out. I went to every bookstore, every library to try to figure out what suicide was about. I bought some books, but there were very few at that time. In the Boston Library in Copley Square, I was perusing and looking, and I found this book about this size, and it said, My Son, My Son. I was so excited because I looked at the first 2 pages and I said, oh my God, the author, Iris Bolton, her story is just like mine. She was blindsided. And I wanted to check it out, and they said no, because it's out of print and this is the only copy we have. So I went across the street, got a bunch of dimes, took copies of every page, front to back. I went home, sat at my kitchen table, read the whole book, was finished by 4 o'clock in the morning, and cried profusely because her story was so much like mine. And I read how she took a whole new identity after losing her son, and how she used that experience in a very positive way. I think she was at Emory at the time studying suicide. And I thought to myself, oh my gosh, because I wanted to do something productive. Well, actually, I didn't know at the time, but reading her story made me realize that I could do something very productive with what happened to me, because it changes your identity. Yes, we need to forge ahead and get meaning, but we also need to accept and embrace our new identity, because the pain is so sharp, the feeling is so deep, and emotions so clear. You are a different person. You know things differently. You use different words. Some of the words you knew have different meaning. And some of the old words that you knew you don't use anymore. So in developing this new identity, it helps you to live out loud. And in that book, I realized that Iris was living out loud. And after reading it, I called the number in the back. Her home phone was in it back in those days. And I called her house. And her husband answered the phone and said Iris was sleeping. And I was crying and tell her, I said, thank you for writing this book. It has changed my life. And he was so gracious and so sweet. When I met Iris 3 or 4 years later, I told her that story. When I met her again, I told her that story. And again, she kind of got tired of hearing it, but I told her as many times as I could, because I don't think she realized how much she had changed my life. So I decided to go back to school. I was applying to law schools at the time, and I decided to go back to school and major in some sort of behavioral health. And I majored in suicide. I majored in sociology. And when I was sitting in the office of the chair and we're discussing me enrolling in his department, I see a book that said suicide. And I asked him, I said, may I read the book? And he said, well, you can have it, it's an old book. And it looked at suicide from a sociological perspective. It was written by Emil Durkheim. And that was like music to my ears, that he was looking at it from a sociological perspective. So on went my journey on completing my master's and completing my PhD. specializing in suicide. My dissertation was on the aftermath of suicide among African Americans, because I found that no one was talking about it. I knew the rates of suicide had gone up among African Americans, especially males, but where were the parents? Where were the people talking about it? Where were the people living out loud? Come on now. We have to talk about this stuff. So I went to a conference in Atlanta. I mean, it's a long story, but I'll tell it briefly, and happened to meet an associate of Iris's, Doris Smith. And she was the very first Black woman that I met who experienced what I experienced. And ironically, her son was named Mark. As months and maybe a year went by, Doris and I kept in touch. In the meantime, the Boston Globe had contacted me because they also realized that the rates have gone up among suicide among African Americans. And they couldn't find any survivors to talk about it. And they searched their files and found an article on my son. His experience or his suicide happened to be in the newspaper because he was missing for 9 months before we found him. And it was a story, so they wrote about it. When they found the article, they wanted to talk to me about it and what it was like, working in my community. And of course, my community, who was so silent and so quiet, it was hard to heal. It was hard for me to get through the healing process because no one really wanted to discuss it. I can remember badgering my mom, who lived in my hometown of Brockton, Massachusetts, who lived there for 50 years. I said, Ma, don't you know anybody? Don't you know anybody who has taken their life? I just want to meet somebody. I want to talk to anybody. And I felt like I was badgering her because she kind of backed up and said, no, sweetie, no, baby, I don't know anybody. And it's so hard for me to imagine a whole town of 100,000 people not experiencing suicide. I felt like I was the only one. I felt like I was alone. So anyway, the Boston Globe wanted to do an article, and it ended up being on the front page of the Boston Globe. And then when you open it up, there's a big picture of me taking half of the page. And people have read that and started contacting me. And one woman contacted me from Teaneck, New Jersey, saying that, you know, she feels alone. She's the only African American in Teaneck, New Jersey. She doesn't know what to do. She called me a couple months later. Oh, there was another suicide that I didn't know about. Called me a few months after that and told me there were 4 suicides among African Americans in Teaneck, New Jersey in the past 6 months. We got to do something. So I wasn't sure what to do. I had a conversation with Karen Dunn-Maxon at AFSP, and she said, you know what, Donna, I think you should do something and get African Americans together so that you all know that you're together and going through the same thing. Why don't I get a donation? I'll talk to Bob Gebbia. We'll get a donation to help you and some others go to Teaneck. I called Doris Smith, who had lost her son, and I called Les Franklin out of Denver, who lost his son. The 3 of us had lost sons right around the same time. And we flew to Teaneck. We didn't think there were going to be much people in the room because there were 4 families. We felt 4 families, so we had about 10 seats. And then when the morning came for people to come to our event, because what it was is going to be Doris, myself, and Les as a panel addressing suicide in the African American community. And as we saw that people were registering and signing up, we kept asking for more seats, more seats, more seats. We ultimately got about 30 seats, and it ended up being standing room only. Not only did the families come, teachers came, lawyers came, funeral directors came. People wanted to know what is going on in their community. So it made us feel kind of good. And after that evening, We sat around a table in a restaurant and said, we got to do this again. So that was the beginning of NOPCAS, the National Organization for People of Color Against Suicide was founded. That was the beginning of it in 1998. We began taking it on the road, and after that in Teaneck, we went to New York, North Carolina, California, Denver, Atlanta, many cities, California, Boston. And then eventually, as money ran out and funders were not thinking about suicide among African Americans anymore, they were onto something else. The funding was hard to keep up to give the conferences. So the last one we gave was in 2010. NOPCAS is still around. We have a website, nopcas.org, if you want to get involved. So, what it does is, I mentioned identity. It's important for us to embrace identity. It's important for us to realize that we've changed, because with me, it was like a Mack truck just hit me, zoom, and it brought me from here to there. And when I'm over here, I realized that I was thinking differently, that I was not the same, that I would never be the same. And I think if we look at our trauma, we need to embrace it and recognize the change, get the meaning, and embrace the new identity that you will have. And when you embrace that identity, you need to live out loud. You need to talk about it. I tried to talk about it as much as I could, but people didn't want to listen, especially in my community. They just felt bad and they didn't know what to say. I had a niece say to me, Auntie Donna, why do you keep telling people about it? Why do you keep talking about it? She didn't understand, and I got it. And that same niece, I overheard her say to another family member when we were planning a family event, she said, Auntie Donna's not coming, is she? And I realized that she didn't want me there because they were tired. They were tired of me breaking down and all my sisters surrounding me, trying to make me feel better at our family events. There's just no way I could come to events smiling and joking when I was in such pain. I was in such pain. So we need to forge meaning from our trauma and build identity. It involves saying, my son killed himself and I'm here. When we are ashamed, we can't live out loud and tell our story. So I ask you to please not feel ashamed. Please don't feel ashamed. Because your stories are what make you. Your stories are who you are. Building identity is about changing the world, and it makes what went wrong precious. It just makes it precious. I didn't recognize the signs. And in Iris's book, she didn't recognize the signs. Did I feel guilty? How do you feel guilty about something you did not know? I usually tell my attendees to my support group that when they talk about guilt, you can't feel guilty if you didn't know. How are we going to know? Sometimes when our kids are growing up, how do you separate them being typical or them being troubled? Typical or troubled? We don't know, especially when we lose them at such an early age. When you search for a new identity and you spend a lot of your energy searching for a good, positive identity, it rescues you from sadness. You no longer feel sad. You embrace this new identity, it's precious to you, and you think about, okay, what am I going to do now? What am I going to do now? Where attention goes, energy flows. So, like Frank said, remove the negative thoughts and begin thinking about what can I do to help others who need to embrace their new identity. I think I'm finished early. So we can get into the discussion with my great friend Carla, or I can talk a little bit more about some of the questions that were out there. And I did in reference to guilt. Please don't feel guilty about something you did not know. And I'll talk a little bit about my support group. I found a support group in 2004, and I did it up until 2015. Took a break for 2 years and started it again just last year in Silver Spring, Maryland. And it's amazing how this new group of people that I'm meeting seem to be okay. They seem to be accepting it and embracing it, because there's so many suicide groups out there now. There's so much literature. You got AFSP and AAS that are working with survivors. It's becoming a normal now. And it really is a difference from when I started in 2004. People were really suffering, crying throughout the whole support group session. And it was a lot of work. It was a lot of work trying to help them get through their pain and get through the healing process. But now, people again are beginning to feel less ashamed. They're beginning to feel it's okay to live out loud. It's okay to talk about it. And I hope that is true with most of you in attendance. I hope that you are embracing your new identity so that you can forge ahead and begin the healing process. Okay, Vanessa, I think we can bring Carla in.
Thank you so much, Donna. Oh, there she is. Carla and Donna, take it away.
First of all, I'd like to thank Donna for this wonderful talk.
Carla, can you turn your volume up a little bit on your computer, I think? Or speak louder?
Can you hear me now better?
Yeah, perfect.
Okay, I was speaking probably more softly than I usually do because I was very moved and I wasn't speaking in my New York voice. So now I'm going to do my New York voice and not so moved. Because what Donna said and what everyone said is just so moving to me right now, especially, you know, during this time when we're all feeling so isolated. And this is making me feel so connected. And I look down and I see there are like 1,000 people out there and we're all out there, as opposed to being just, you know, kind of so isolated by ourselves, and talking about sadness and talking about loss. And all the loss that we're all going through now is just bringing up the other loss. Just briefly for the people who are listening, I lost my husband to suicide in 1989. I also, like Donna, felt very blindsided by his death. And, you know, even though it's been almost 30 years, I think of what he missed, what I missed, and probably what's going on now with all the loss. I think of his loss. But Don and I go way back and go back with, I think, everybody up here. And like Vanessa said, Donna and I have had a lot of cries together, a lot of laughs together. And though I know a lot of you out there can think that how can they ever laugh again, or how can we ever laugh again? The thing is, we're all in this together, and we all share this, and we're all one. And so this is very meaningful. So I wanted to ask Donna from her talk, I want to talk about the stigma. I mean, to me, the stigma, you mentioned that you felt that maybe there wasn't as much stigma now, but I'm still feeling the stigma of suicide when we talk about our loved ones taking their lives. And I was just wondering, do you think that maybe there's less stigma because there's just more you know, we hear, we read about it more. I just remember that when Harry killed himself, you couldn't say the S word, you know, we were so worried about the word suicide. So I was just wondering what you think about the silence and the stigma.
I think that it's not as bad as it was when we first went through it. I know I would feel like when I entered a room, if I went to a funeral in my hometown, I'd feel like when I entered a room, a bunch of the people in it, that they were talking about me. They were saying, "Oh, there's that woman. There's Donna. Her son killed himself." And because it was such a aberrant event. It was just not heard of. So I really felt that I was like this person that everybody identified with. Wow, her son took his own life. So, and much of that was probably implied, but I just don't think from the support group that I have now, that when we meet and how they feel very comfortable with talking about it. They don't talk about stigma. They have a lot of support, their neighbors, their church. Everybody seems to be supporting them. But every now and then, Carla, I would hear someone tell a story that someone made a comment that Black people don't kill themselves. I said, what? I mean, they're still saying that? Or, you know, their church is trying to make them pray and read the Bible, and that will make them feel better. And I still, every now and then, will hear things like that, and it's just appalling. But for the most part, I think it's changing because of all the work that all of us in this room have done.
I wonder if I wonder the personal stigma that we feel. I mean, the guilt that, you know, that we feel that somehow in our hearts of hearts, no matter what we tell ourselves and what we know and how many times we go over and over, there's some part of us that thinks we could have saved them if we could have. If we turn this over and that over, and no matter what we know, there's some part of us that maybe that we wish we could have saved them, or we wish we could have known, or we wish we could have helped them. And that's that feeling of powerless. And maybe some of the stigma is the stigma that we feel ourselves for not having saved them, even though we know that now that we did everything we could. And then many times we probably did save them over the years, and we just didn't know about it. We just know the end of the story, that they died, but we don't know how many times that they may have even thought of that. So to hear you say that about your support group gives me a lot of you know, hope to think that the stigma is somewhat alleviating, even though I think there is a kind of a basic silence still about suicide because of what I hear. But maybe it's different in different communities or in different.
Well, it's subsided some. It's like someone just made a comment, the stigma is still there, but not as bad. And that's very true. That's very true. And a lot of that stigma, I know with me, was probably self-imposed. And so we need to stop doing that to ourselves. I think the reason it was more self-imposed with me was because I didn't know anything about suicide. And I can remember growing up thinking if anyone took their life, it was somebody who did something to them.
Right.
And I'm thinking that that's what people are thinking when they look at me and they look at my situation.
I just know that when Harry killed himself, I felt crazy. I just thought the world had turned upside down, almost like it is now. That you know, that this was just something that I just couldn't believe, I couldn't accept. And I just felt so alone and so alienated and such a loss. And the way you described that also, that feeling, and I think everyone here understands that you know, it's just our world changes. And I know personally over the years that, you know, the loss and the missing and the love doesn't go away, but the acceptance of a new kind of normal, which now I'm hearing every day, you know, on the news, the new normal, but this is something that we've kind of dealt with too. And this idea, and I'd like to ask you more about that, how you found meaning, because I think to find meaning out of something that feels so meaningless at the beginning, that there's to how we can feel meaning or find meaning through the suicide of our loved ones?
Unfortunately, it took me 4 years because I was in all of that, what you were talking about, your life being turned upside down, you not knowing how to relate to people anymore, you feeling so ashamed, feeling so guilty. But, you know, I had my daughter, I had her, she helped me, I think, more than I helped her. And she was only 16 and she had to go through this trauma. And I said to her once, how did I miss it? How did I miss it? How could I have possibly missed it? And she said, Ma, you were always asking Mark, how was he feeling and what was wrong? You're always saying that to him, which tells me that I must have seen something in hindsight that there was something wrong, but didn't know enough to pick up on it. Because again, you can't tell the difference between being typical and being troubled, especially with our young kids when they're growing up. But yeah.
I think to me, is the sorrow that they're not here, that we miss them, that we love them, that we wish they could be with us. And, you know, that they left us so abruptly and we don't know why, and probably we'll never know why, or we can have our ideas of that. And I think to get into terms of that, of the loss, to accept that to try to remember, as you were saying, to remember, and as Frank was saying, that dash, to remember their lives and not the way that they died. And, you know, that's what I'm trying to do now when I'm reading the obituaries of all the people who are dying because of the virus. I don't want to think of them, they died because of the virus. I want to know who they were. And so I'm kind of identifying with that, because when we talk about losing our loved ones to suicide, it's always the suicide, but not about the actual person who has died. So it isn't that they died of the suicide or they died of the virus, but who they were as a person, how they lived and not how they died. So
yeah, I kind of regret the fact that I didn't build up the great life he had in his 20 years. He was such a wonderful person, such a great baseball player. And now people just remember him as a suicide victim. And I regret that I didn't promote that when we had the funeral. I mean, I just didn't know what to do. I was so lost. And I look at some of the funerals now that people have for their loved ones, and they have these big booklets, and it explains their beautiful life and these pictures, and it's like, wow, I wish I had done that. Yeah, we do. I understand that.
well, I think thanks to all the trailblazers out here that are here, that has helped us to be able to do that, to bring all of that out into the public. But there's a lot of shame and there's a lot of guilt. I had a lot of anger, and there was just confusion and disorientation and all of that. So that, I mean, to me, to think that there are like 1,000 people out there here and we're all like connected, as Vanessa used the word connected, is just amazing. And, you know, the fact that we have known each other and met each other and are sharing all our stories is a pretty, and not our stories, but the stories of our loved ones too. And, you know, and what you've done in Community of Color is just really amazing, Donna, because, you know, you brought all of that out when nobody was actually talking about that.
Yeah, I almost had to. It gave me a good reason to live out loud and to talk about it and to tell everyone about it. It gave me a good reason to do that. Yeah, and some of the questions, Vanessa, do you want us to address some of the questions? Because I see a lot of them coming in.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think one of them that people are still grappling with is the sense of guilt. You know, sometimes I call it the sins of commission or omission, when they feel like they could have done something that they didn't, or they did something that they wish they hadn't. Just sort of maybe talk about that a bit.
Was that a question from the audience?
I sort of folded a few questions into one, which is the audience saying, I'm still dealing so much with feeling guilt. And how would you suggest, what tools, how would you suggest I can work on that or work through that?
Yeah, there's really, I can't ever give anybody advice on how to feel. This is something that they control because it's internal. It's when you decide for yourself to come to grips with what happened and what part you had to play in it. And once you do that, you'll realize that you're not a superwoman or a superman, and that there's sometimes things we cannot control and it just slips through our fingers. And to come to grips with that, that it's not your fault.
I feel the guilt is the overwhelming feeling that, somehow, if we had the power, we could have saved them. And that's why I think suicide is so humbling, because at the end of the day, we realize that you can love somebody, but you can't will your spirit over to them. You can love them and you can adore them, you can do anything, but you can't make them live if that is what they have decided not to do. And I think the guilt is the one that lives with us the longest, that even as the years go by, you can wake up in the night, you said, but I could have, but I should have, but I still, that's very hard to know, though, to live without the resolution. And I think it's just something that we have to live with, that guilt, that overwhelming guilt that somehow we should have done something or could have done something is one of the hardest. That feeling of regret and guilt is, to me, is one of the hardest, emotions that are associated with suicide.
Right. And, when we do that, when we do the woulda, shoulda, couldas, we're looking at life in the rearview mirror. Now, when you drive a car, you don't look in the rearview mirror to forge ahead. You look in the front mirror. You look in the front. So if we could do that and stop looking in the rearview mirror, it's over, it's done. You can't change it. You can't change it. So we need to just accept what has happened and move ahead. Just move ahead. But again, that has to come within. I can't advise anybody on how to stop feeling guilty, because you can't tell people how to feel. Some people, when they come to my group, they feel angry. Anger gets in the way of healing. And I can't tell them not to feel angry. You can't do that, because you're not going to be able to heal if you feel angry. I have to let them get through it. And eventually, when they listen to other people's stories, they realize that, anger is not helping them. Sometimes it takes people a whole year not to feel angry again. But the anger is something you have to get through. The guilt is something you have to get through. There's no magic bullet on stop feeling guilty or stop feeling angry. It's all from within. And if we get to know ourselves and realize what we're going through, we can sort of accept what's going around us.
So there's another question. I think of a number of people watching are supporting people who are grieving a suicide. And there are questions about, they've been told not to say, I'm sorry for your loss, or they find it difficult to find a way of supporting the suicide loss survivor. So are there suggestions for them? Or maybe more importantly, in my work, I always have loss survivors who are saying that their family members and their friends are saying stupid things or not being helpful or not reaching out. So would you have advice for the loss survivors? It's not really fair, but sometimes we have to educate those around us in what we need.
We do, because people want to do something, they want to say something. Those who don't respond, it's only because they don't know what to say. But the best thing to say is like, I understand. No, help me understand what you're going through. Do you want to talk about it? You don't have to say, I'm sorry, da, da, da. You don't have to do anything. Just say, do you want to talk about it? Do you want to tell me what happened? Because that's the only thing I wanted to do. I wanted to talk about it and talk about it and talk about it, because it would help me understand what went on. If I just kept it to myself, it would kill me. So I needed to talk about it, but I didn't have anybody to talk about it with. So I think if you give the person an opportunity to talk, that would be a good thing.
I think it's also very important to say the person's name, to say the actual name of the person, and that the person exists as a name. And I found that the hardest, when people wouldn't even kind of acknowledge that Harry's name, or that Harry died, or, you know, they would cross the street and wouldn't even acknowledge. And, you know, here I had been married for 21 years and people knew who he was, and couldn't even bring themselves to say, even, I'm sorry for your loss. And, you know, it was a very difficult position to be in, I think. I think all you need to say is, you know, I'm sorry that, you know, your son, your husband died, and using their name, I think, is really important too. And
That is, I agree, because when
maybe even a memory of them, and, you know, like a regular death, you know, that's how I felt. Like, you know, this could be like a regular death, you know, how when you say to somebody, oh, I remember your father was so nice to me, or something like that, can also be that. Because, and I get it, that it brings up an awkward situation, that people don't know what to say. But, and, you know, as the years go on, I've become a little bit more tolerant. But I always say that when I talk, that if my publishers had allowed it, I would have put it in an anti-acknowledgement page along with my acknowledgement page, because there were people that I expected to come by or to say things to me, and that they didn't. And it really, I found it painful.
you make a very good point when you say that a good thing to say to people is, I remembered Harry, or I remembered Mark, and I remember when we used to do this or that, because it always made me feel good when I'd run into a classmate of his and they would talk about him and how they knew him and in what way they knew him. Just something like that you could say to the person, how you knew the person and what you went through.
The worst thing is probably like, why did they kill themselves? I mean, when you get one of those questions, and I was startled how many people asked me that. What happened? Why? You know, what went wrong? You know, why did he kill himself? It's like, you know, if, you know, you meet people who get divorced, you don't say, oh yeah, what went wrong in your marriage, you know? So it's like people ask, you know, asking that kind of personal, intrusive.
I know. You just don't answer it.
Another, well, first of all, I have a plug. We have on our conference page, there's a number of poems and resources. One of them is called My Wish List, and that's sort of a wish for what you might want other people to do for you. It's really beautiful. I found survivors to find it helpful. There are some questions about how suicides can fracture families. I think how people grieve differently, how they respond to it, and maybe if you can talk about that and
it really does either bring families closer or bring families apart, because like a husband and wife who lost a child, they both going to grieve differently. Even though they were in the same household and bringing up the same child, they're going to grieve differently because they had different relationships, because the suicide had different relationships with the mother than they did the father. They do grieve differently. So you've got to understand that. Please don't get upset with the other spouse if they're not matching your grief. So, you know, I'm always amazed when I meet a husband and a wife who brought them closer together. I have a husband and wife who was a part of NOPCAS, Dr. William and Naomi Powell, and they're in the room, so I'm giving them a shout out. But they together, I don't email one without emailing the other. To me, they are one, because they have come together when they lost their son, and they have worked with me for a long period of time, but I just marvel over the relationship and I love it. And even we know of families like Jerry and Elsie Wyrock and Donna and Phil Satow, who come together and go on this mission. I think it's great. So there are some families who come closer, and it does separate others. Just allow the other family member to grieve differently, and don't expect them to grieve like you're grieving.
I like to quote Ed Dunn, a psychologist, who said that suicide hits a family like a meteorite, you know, like, and everybody orbits in his or her own circuit of grief. And we think that when suicide will hit the community or hit the family, we'll all merge together. We all go off and we all grieve in different kinds of ways. And sometimes that can be even more alienating because the people that you feel that should be the closest to you, should understand you, are grieving in a way that's very different from you. And that also sometimes can increase the feeling of isolation too.
So another question, and I'm thinking we might need a stretch in a little bit. So we might make the break between this conversation and the healing a little bit longer. But one more question is sort of the difference in grief in different relationships. If a mother loses a child, if a sibling loses a brother or sister, you know, if a child loses a parent, do you see things? Is there a difference? Is that important, and how?
Well, in my experience, my daughter grieved differently than I did. And it took me several years before I realized what she was going through, because she spoke at one of our NOPCAS conferences, and I was really surprised on what she spoke about and what she said in reference to getting through it. She didn't want to bother me with what she was going through because she felt so bad for me. As the mother, I felt bad for her. We almost didn't know how to really sit down and have a good conversation about it. But everything I did in the community, in the finding of NOPCAS, she was involved. She came to all the conferences, and so she learned how to forge ahead with the healing process. But her grief was definitely different from mine.
I definitely think there's a difference, especially with spouses. Because, you know, we're not related, but we're more
Carla,
partners.
now that you're, wait, Carla, now that you're a New Yorker, you can step back a little bit because there's a little bit of an echo.
Okay, hey, you know. Okay, so that with spouses, because we're partners, there's a lot, you get a lot more anger than you would be, let's say, with a child or a parent, because there's somebody that was sharing their life with you and you were sharing their life. So there's more of an anger. And then of course there's a sadness, but there's also, because you're more of a partner, we don't have that same, not level, but the same difference of heartbreak. And I think no matter who you lose, it's a different kind, whether it's a young girl losing her mother or an older person losing their adult parent. I think every kind of who the person is we lost is a very different kind of a grief, even though it's the shared grief of complete heartbrokenness and sadness. But we do have different relationships with the person that we lost.
Yes, as Frank said, grief is individual.
Right.
It's all individual, even in families.
Okay, I want to do one more question, and then I do think that we probably all need a break. We'll take a half an hour to sort of stretch, make ourselves comfortable, and then we'll come back to hear Iris. But let me just look at this. It was about cultures. For some people, it's important in their culture not to speak of someone who has died. Can you speak to this?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that?
That there are some cultures where it's really not okay to speak of somebody after they've died. You know, I think in the Native American community, I've been having some conversations with them. Sometimes people come in to do grief work and help, and they don't understand sort of the way that different cultures process grief, and that it's a bit of a taboo to talk about the suicide. Well,
let me just say this. Many years ago, NOPCAS was given an assignment by SPRC to write on different cultures losing their life. So we had a 2-day meeting, and I invited several people from the Native American community. And one woman said, when she went back to her community, and I think she lived in Phoenix, I want to say, that they criticized her for coming to such a meeting. They said, you should never, ever talk about this kind of thing in an open meeting. And they criticized her. And a few months later, her son was suicidal. And when they found that out, they said, see what we mean, see what we mean. But we had a meeting again the following year, and she came because she didn't care. And that it had nothing to do with that belief system that they had. that she needed to be there and talk about suicide. So yes, Vanessa, the Native American community, it's not really even, mental health isn't even a word. They look at it as an imbalance within their system, and then you need to do things to balance your psyche. So in reference to some communities not even believing in it, you just sort of go with them, with it. If this is what they believe, this is fine. But tell me, how do you handle a suicide? How do you handle someone who wants to think about taking their own life? I get what you're saying, but just explain to me, how do you handle that in your community? And then when they tell you, you embrace it and you enhance it with whatever you do. But don't expect whatever you do to help in their community. You just have to embrace it, because someone else thinks about it differently. Just back off. Just back off and ask them how they handle it.
Cultural humility, learning about different cultures. So I want to thank you both so much for this really rich and lively discussion. And I'm seeing on the comments how much it's helped people. I don't think we can get to everything. One of the things that I sometimes say to people in terms of feelings or reactions that they have is it's perfectly normal, those feelings and reactions, and you just have to feel them until you don't feel them anymore. You might be angry, and it's okay to be angry, and just be angry until that day you wake up and you're less angry. You may be searching for answers and searching for answers. Some answers you'll find, some answers you might not find, but just keep searching until you don't feel the need to search so much. Thank you so much, Donna and Carla. I knew this would be such a rich, beautiful conversation, and you've really helped so many of us.